The story of the bird sniffing her. Once upon a time, there were two nieces and nephews living together in the same house. The aunt is old, her husband died a long time ago. The grandchild was still young, about 12 years old from his parents. Their family is poor, they only have a few acres of rice fields, not enough to make a living. So every day she has to go hunting for crabs and snails or gleaning for food. During the past few years, the harvest has been good. Even though the two of them did not have enough, they still lived happily. Every day, I followed my aunt carrying a basket to the fields, singing with enthusiasm. But unfortunately the harvest that year was poor. Then came the drought season, so it didn't do any good. It's not very sunny, but it definitely won't rain, making the lakes and ponds dry. The fields are all cracked. The two of them, like other poor people, went looking for crabs and snails in dry areas. But it takes forever to catch crabs and snails. But the house has been exhausted for a long time. We know what to find to support each other. People who have good health go to the forest to cut firewood and exchange it for food to survive. As for the two children, their health was weak and they had to stay home and starve. Death was threatening them. Luckily, that morning, a neighbor came to inform us that some fields of rice in the neighboring village had begun to be harvested. She felt so weak that she couldn't stand up anymore. Only I was slightly awake. The guy tried to sit up. A neighbor brought a bowl of vegetable soup. I drank it and felt good, so I quickly stood up and followed them. They arrived just in time for the harvest. But those who reap are few, and those who glean are many. All were hungry but gleaned very well. They ventured into plucking rice, ignoring the farmer's whip and beating them without mercy. It was not until afternoon that the nephew brought the rice home. Leo Teo only has a handful the size of a broom. But the guy doesn't mind. He beat, threshed, roasted and then put it in a mortar. Just a moment later, he poured it into the pot and put it on the stove. When the pot of porridge began to boil, her body suddenly turned over and groaned. I rushed in to visit her. She groaned and complained of stomach pain, telling her to go get some ginger for her. I hesitated to go, but seeing that she seemed in danger, I quickly made my way into the village. After the grandchild left, the aunt got up and sat in the kitchen to boil the fire for a pot of porridge. When the porridge was cooked, she added salt to taste and took a sip. Wherever the grain goes into the stomach, the flesh and skin seem to come back to life. Seeing that the grandchild was still not home, she scooped out a bowl to save for the grandchild and then sat down to eat again. In an instant, she had finished her portion. She lay down again but still felt hungry. Seeing that her grandchild still hadn't returned, she thought, "He's probably been fed by someone, that's why it took him so long. If he's hungry, whether he's okay or not, he has to come home early." Thinking that, the aunt got up and ate a little of her grandchild's porridge. She went out the door to look. Still no sign of him. Maybe he's already eaten, so he can sit back and warm himself. We can finish eating for him. Thinking that, she felt secure and took another sip of her grandchild's portion. By the time the grandchild brought the ginger back, the bowl of porridge only had a little water left at the bottom. I asked her. She did not answer. But I can guess everything. I covered my face and sobbed. "I'm angry with you, resent you and curse you." After a while, he brought the bowl of porridge to her bed, held it close to his mouth and said in a bitter voice, "That's a little more, breathe it in. Sniff me, sniff me." The next morning, I still hadn't woken up until noon, so I came closer and touched my body, and oh my gosh, my whole body was cold. From then on, around approximately, it was late at night, people heard the sound of birds calling in the air, "Sniff you. Sniff you." The monotonous chirping of birds reminds the two of them of the difficult days of their lives. 1. Ko-di. This story according to the Ha Tin and Quang Bin people is similar, but has a slightly different plot. Once upon a time, there are two poor nieces living together. One year there was a great famine and people died like straw. The two girls ran out of rice and were weak, so they had to sit at home and wait for death. Meanwhile, the nephew suddenly saw a mouse. He said to the mouse, "Say goodbye to the mouse. We are starving here." The mouse said, "The rice was still in the bag. Why did it die so quickly?" The nephew ran into the room and scraped the bag of rice until he found only the last grain. Seeing him throw it to the ground, the mouse said, "It's a gem from heaven. Just keep it and take it out to breathe 3 times a day and that's enough to live." I picked it up, respectfully gave it to her, told the story and said, "Luckily we will live." Oh, 2. The ant thought she was crazy and talking nonsense and didn't pay any attention. But a few days later, while she couldn't walk, the child was still happily singing. She was surprised at the magic of the pearl. From then on, the two of them took a little pearl at mealtime, each of them inhaling a little, thus prolonging their lives for a few dozen days. But then one day, while inhaling, the ant suddenly let it go. Pearl slipped into his throat. She kept spitting but the pearl still didn't come out. I urged her to cough, urging her to vomit profusely. But even though she tried everything, the pearl still refused to come out. And then the dead child turned into a bird sniffing at her, constantly reminding her of her carelessness. Some people say that when I die I turn into a bird. Today that bird still makes the sounds, "Oh ho! Oh ho!" was the sound of the nephew urging her to cough and spit out grains of rice. Nagaean people also have a story like the above, but instead of grains of rice, there are beans. And here, the person who should have inhaled the pearl that slipped into her throat was her nephew. Of course I live but you die. After that, I loved her, and whenever the bean season came, she would cry out, "Dear aunt, come back and eat rice with soybeans." 3. Someone said, I later died and became a howler bird. So later on, when the bean season came, the howling bird had something to eat and remembered her, calling out, "She-ho, she-ho. The rice has sprouted, the beans are ripe, fly back to eat." 4. Perhaps this is also the version is different, but the narrator's memory is confused and not complete. The Nung people also have a story that is more or less similar to our story. There are 2 nieces and nephews living together. My name is Pit too. When there was a famine, the house ran out of rice, so she and her nephew followed people into the forest to dig tubers. It wasn't until nearly noon that I found a line. She told me to sit and wait while I dug. She dug for a long time and still couldn't find any tubers, but her stomach hadn't had any for several days. When she was close to digging the tuber, she bent down to pick it up, but unexpectedly lost her grip and plunged her head into the hole. I ran to pull her up, but because I was small, weak, and hungry, I couldn't pull her up. She died. Pistu was then turned into a howler bird by the fairy, always saying, "Ah ai." Nung means ant. The story also has an additional detail. The howling bird flew into the palace and pecked at the eye of the king who caused the famine. 5. Perhaps this detail was recently added by collectors. 1. According to Trang newspaper. 2. Ant. Nagi Tin language. 3. According to the Declaration of Hong Duong Village. 4. According to Nguyen Van Ngoc. Ancient Tales of the South, Bee Birds, Volume 1, 5. According to Vietnamese Northern Tales. Thank you for joining us for today's fairy tale. We hope these stories bring joy and meaning to your day. If you love our channel, please hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any exciting tales. Wishing you a good night and sweet dreams. See you in the next story.